Hello and welcome. In today's video we are going to explore a dramatic and compelling story. The headline: 3 African presidents signed a treaty at midnight. France sent commandos to stop them. We will use that as a launching point to examine the evolving power dynamics in Africa, how Western influence is challenged, and then broaden the lens to how the United States is responding in its foreign policy, economics, and geopolitics. By the end, we will compare the trajectories of Africa and the US today, and reflect on what this means for the future of global power. Let us begin. Part 1: The Midnight Treaty and the Challenge to French Influence. Let us begin with that dramatic phrase: 3 African presidents signed a treaty at midnight, France sent commandos to stop them. It is evocative. It suggests conspiracy, urgency, and high stakes. In many ways it captures the tension between African sovereignty and lingering post-colonial influence. To ground ourselves in reality, a parallel real event is the alliance signed by the military leaders of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. In September 2023, those 3 countries agreed a mutual defense pact, the Liptako-Gourma Charter, creating what they called the Alliance of Sahel States. That pact, though not exactly signed, at midnight, signaled a willingness to form security cooperation independent of external powers. In summer 2024, the juntas of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso formally declared their split from the Economic Community of West African States (ECOWAS), reinforcing their sovereignty path. They have increasingly resisted interventions or pressures from former colonial powers, especially France. This is part of a broader unfolding story. Over the past few years, many Francophone African nations have expelled or demanded the withdrawal of French military forces and bases. The formal, defense agreements, that allowed French intervention powers have been terminated unilaterally by several states. This marks a strategic pivot. African governments are asserting that they will chart their own security architecture without automatic reliance on France. So the Midnight Treaty can be viewed as symbolic, a moment of assertion, a clandestine pact, a defiance of old power structures. The notion that France would send commandos suggests a countermeasure, a reflexive colonial intervention. Whether that exact imagery reflects a real event is less important than its resonance. Many African states now interpret French influence as interference, and are actively resisting. One vivid illustration is Burkina Faso's current leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He has publicly reproached French President Macron, saying Macron is insulting all Africans, and demanded that African states break military pacts with France, push French forces out, and devise independent armies. This is not rhetoric alone, it reflects deep shifts in the balance of influence. In sum, the Midnight Treaty frames a dynamic in motion: African states renegotiating their sovereignty, dismantling dependency, and contesting the legacy of external control. Part 2: Deep Dive: The Current State of Africa. Now let us broaden the lens to current affairs across Africa. What is happening inside Africa today, politically, economically, and in geopolitics, that sets the stage for this new chapter? Political unrest, coups, and the militarization of power. Africa in recent years has seen a resurgence of military takeovers. A number of countries that once had fragile democracies have slipped back into military rule. The drivers are many: weak institutions, corruption, economic inequality, security threats especially from jihadist groups, and public frustration. A recent flashpoint is Madagascar. Protests and political clashes have ended in the president fleeing, and the military stepping in to assume power, declaring it will govern for 18 months before elections. The African Union has suspended Madagascar's membership, and the international community is alarmed. Another angle is the debt burden. Many African states carry steep debts, often to external lenders, which constrains their budgets and makes them vulnerable to external pressures. Civil society groups have criticized South Africa's G20 presidency, for instance, for failing to push meaningful debt relief for developing countries. In addition, climate change and resource conflicts are intensifying local tensions. In parts of Central Africa, pastoralist-farmer clashes have become more frequent due to shrinking grazing lands and unpredictable rainfall. Aid cuts, humanitarian crises, and health shocks. Foreign aid has long been a pillar of development in Africa, especially in health, infrastructure, and humanitarian response. But recently, some major donors have pulled back. For example, the United States has cut significant portions of aid to Africa, leading to severe impacts on health systems. In nations such as Ethiopia, malaria and cholera outbreaks have worsened as the funding gaps widened. In southern Africa, the World Food Programme is closing its regional office due to donor funding shortfalls. These disruptions disproportionately affect the vulnerable, displaced persons, children, refugees, people dependent on HIV or tuberculosis programs. The rollback of programs such as PEPFAR is especially alarming, considering it has saved millions of lives. Geopolitics. New partnerships, shift of alliances. As Western influence recedes, African states are building stronger ties with other global actors. China, Russia, Gulf states, India, and Turkey are playing major roles in infrastructure investment, security cooperation, and diplomacy. The Wagner Group's involvement in the Central African Republic and other locales is one example. The deeper engagement of Russia, often as a counterweight to Western pressure, is reshaping alignments. Meanwhile, China remains a major financier and builder of infrastructure across the continent. Moreover, African states are creating their own blocs and pacts, like the Alliance of Sahel states, that exclude Western players. Economic pressures and trade friction. African economies are under strain. Inflation, lack of industrialization, commodity price volatility, and lack of diversification make many countries vulnerable to external shocks. A striking case is South Africa. Because of new reciprocal U.S. tariffs, Pretoria is now facing up to 30% tariffs on its exports to the U.S. unless it negotiates a new bilateral trade deal. The tariffs are hitting sectors like automobile exports, chemicals, and agricultural goods, areas that are core to South Africa's Cape economy. This has pushed South Africa to urgently seek a new trade agreement with the U.S. Simultaneously, South Africa is grappling with the suspension of U.S. aid, particularly for health programs, following decisions by the Trump administration. The aid suspension has sparked debates over equity, racial politics, and modern diplomacy. Even Ghana now faces legal challenges from civil society over a U.S. deportation agreement. Democracy Hub, a rights group, filed suit claiming the agreement was not constitutionally approved and may violate international norms. Burkina Faso meanwhile has rejected U.S. proposals to accept deportees, calling the idea indecent, and rejecting pressure. Thus we see a continent in flux, states pulling back from old ties, asserting autonomy, competing for new partners, and confronting internal pressures exacerbated by shrinking external support. Part 3, the United States, Strategy, Domestic Politics, and its Shifting Role. If Africa is undergoing a rebalancing, the United States is wrestling with its own contradictions: how to remain a global power while coping with domestic challenges, political polarization, and shifting priorities. Foreign policy turn and aid retrenchment. Under the current U.S. administration, there has been a marked shift in foreign aid policy. Large cuts to Africa have exposed the fragility of development partnerships. Programs that were once pillars of U.S. soft power and global health cooperation are now under threat. Aid is no longer an assured instrument of influence. With the rollback, the ability of the U.S. to project moral leadership or to leverage its humanitarian diplomacy is weakened. Simultaneously, the U.S. is reasserting protectionist trade policy. Tariffs, trade wars, reciprocal measures are tools being wielded. The U.S. is demanding more favorable terms, and that is reshaping global trade dynamics. For example, the 30% tariff on South African goods signals how trade is becoming a weapon in geopolitical competition. On security and strategic competition, the U.S. is trying to recalibrate its posture in Africa. It seeks to counter the influence of China and Russia, especially in critical zones like the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and the Gulf of Guinea. Domestic politics, polarization, and foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy decisions are increasingly influenced by domestic political narratives. Nationalism, America first, rhetoric, and voter pressures shape how much resources the U.S. allocates abroad. That may explain part of the aid cuts and willingness to overhaul trade treaties. Additionally, immigration, refugee policy, and resettlement are highly contentious in U.S. politics. The controversial program to grant asylum to white South Africans is one such flashpoint. The Trump administration justified it by alleging systemic discrimination against Afrikaners, though those claims are widely rejected by observers. This policy choice signals how geopolitics and identity politics can sharply intersect. Moreover, the U.S. itself is facing internal challenges: infrastructure decay, inequality, political polarization, fluctuating global leadership reputation. These domestic pressures limit how much ambition the U.S. can carry abroad. U.S.-Africa relations, partnerships, tensions, and limits. The U.S. remains a key global actor, and Africa remains a contested space for influence. But the terms of engagement are shifting. First, the U.S. has begun to use hard leverage. It is pressing for deportation deals, as seen in its talks with West African nations to accept undocumented migrants. Burkina Faso's rejection is a rare public pushback. Ghana's lawsuit over a deportation agreement also reflects the tension in U.S. efforts to externalize migration burdens. Second, trade has become more transactional. Instead of long-term development partnerships, deals are judged in terms of reciprocity, market access, and strategic value. Third, the U.S. involvement in Africa is also constrained by distractions in other theaters: competition with China, involvement in Europe or the Middle East, domestic priorities. It cannot pour unlimited resources into every region. Fourth, diplomacy must navigate changing African agency. African leaders will not quietly accept aid or security programs with strings attached. They insist on respect, sovereignty, and more balanced objectives. The May 2025 Oval Office meeting between U.S. President Trump and South African President Ramaphosa is a case in point. In that meeting, Trump confronted Ramaphosa with claims about white farmer persecution in South Africa, which Ramaphosa strongly denied. That media spectacle illustrated both how high the stakes are and how sensitive the relationships have become. Part 4: Africa and the U.S., a comparison in transition. We have looked separately at Africa and the U.S. Now let us compare, reflect on their trajectories, and draw lessons. Sovereignty and identity versus global leadership imperatives. Africa's shift is about reclaiming sovereignty, asserting identity, rejecting the legacy of external domination. The continent is saying, we want partners, not patrons. The Midnight Treaty symbolism speaks to that, leaders gathering quietly to break free from influence. By contrast, the U.S. still aims for global leadership, but is increasingly constrained by internal limits. It must balance strategic ambitions with domestic politics and limited resources. External dependency versus strategic autonomy. Many African nations have long been dependent on foreign aid, foreign security assistance, and trade regimes shaped by external powers. But they are trying to break that cycle, building new alliances, demanding respect, diversifying partners. The U.S., conversely, is reducing its dependency on foreign alliances in certain areas, e.g. pulling back on open-ended aid, and instead pushing for efficiency, conditionality, and reciprocal terms. Soft power, hard power, and leverage. The U.S. still retains vast military and economic power, but its soft influence is weakening in many African quarters due to perceived hypocrisy or self-interest. Its pull via culture, development, and leadership is under strain in a more multipolar world. African states, meanwhile, are experimenting with new power levers, regional security pacts, alignment with non-Western powers, economic bargaining. Fragility and risk on both sides. Africa's path is risky. Military rule, economic weakness, climate shocks, governance deficits, all can undermine progress. Rejecting external support sometimes means stepping into capacity gaps. The U.S. also risks overextension, misjudging priorities, alienating allies, and losing credibility if it is seen as inconsistent or opportunistic. But there is space for convergence. If the U.S. can adapt to more equal partnerships, and if African states can build institutions and governance capacity, then new models of cooperation, less hierarchical, more respectful, can emerge. Part 5, Conclusion. A new era, a new responsibility. Let us conclude. The image of 3 African presidents signing a treaty at midnight, and France rushing commandos to stop them, is dramatic. Perhaps partially symbolic, but it captures a bold reality. The continent is pushing back, redefining itself, and demanding a new order. Africa today is in motion. States are rethinking their alliances, asserting independence, redirecting external relationships, and confronting internal crises. The U.S. stands at a pivot, debating how much it remains a global benefactor or becomes a more transactional power, and whether it can sustain influence in a more contested world. The key tension will be whether Africa succeeds in building viable, sovereign, accountable states that can claim their space on the world stage, or whether the pressures of poverty, conflict, and external leverage pull them back. At the same time, whether the U.S. can recalibrate its foreign policy, learning to partner with dignity rather than dominance, will determine how relevant it remains. To you, the viewer, keep watching this space. The next decade could rewrite how power is shared. Will Africa forge new, independent pathways, or be reshaped yet again by external forces? Will the U.S. act as a constructive partner, or retreat into isolation? The stakes are high. Thank you for watching. If you liked this deep dive, please like, share, and subscribe. In upcoming videos, we can go deeper into particular countries, explore African regional bodies, or examine U.S. foreign policy shifts in more detail. Let me know what you want next.